The sermon title is not a typo. Paul said, "Do not be conformed to this world," but I chose the title, "I appeal to you to be conformed to this world." Wendy dutifully asked me if that is what I meant because I quoted scripture wrong. She is normally quite good in catching that kind of thing, and I said to her, no, that's what the title should be. She was hesitant, but here we are with that same title against the backdrop of those passages that Ed read for us. I appeal to you to be conformed to this world. I adapted Paul's words, specifically thinking of the town meeting we had on Tuesday evening. I saw a number of you there, and even some who sat with us till, I think it was 8 minutes after midnight, when the meeting was adjourned. Let me see who were there. I sat in front, so I didn't want to look back all the time. Who sat till after midnight? Some hardy people here. It was for me an interesting meeting, an interesting experience to be part of that meeting. 5 hours of face-to-face public conversation, discourse. People speaking their minds freely, most often respectfully. And there was, even though there were some serious differences that surfaced about a variety of themes and topics, there was even some very sharp humor mixed into the serious conversations that took place. It reminded me in some way of the dorm meetings, the house meetings we had as a dorm. I was in a dorm, we had 460 people residing in the dorm, and I think it was every month that we had the house meeting, with everybody gathered there, and time was not of the essence. People, especially those who would see for themselves a future in politics, would take the opportunity and go to town, just talking prolifically, especially those that also were thinking of a career in law, using that to practice their skills. And you had the collection that I also observed at the town meeting. You had the grumpy ones and the difficult ones. You had the ones who would take every ordinance or regulation and every rule and analyze that and argue about it. I was also sometimes part of that category when I wanted to cause trouble for the House Committee and the other people, to declare several meetings illegally called, so that we had to reconstitute the meeting just to keep them on the right track and say, all right, you better adhere to the bylaws, do things legally, otherwise all the decisions are null and void, invalid. We had some of that as well at the town meeting. People that were difficult. But my experience of it was generally a very positive one, especially as the meeting progressed and became quite a protracted affair. I was very impressed with how the townspeople listened to each other. No matter how many difficult questions, and sometimes what I regard as nitpicking questions, were asked, and no matter how much the Finance Committee and the Board of Selectmen were put in the dock and questioned, people remained respectfully and listened attentively. I must say around 10 o'clock, you could pick up that the meeting was getting a bit restless and tired of small affairs being raised and being made issues. But nevertheless, people persisted with a respectful presence and an attentiveness. I observed that people, apart from listening to each other respectfully, also had the ability to identify and gather and find common ground around a higher purpose that drew them together. They were able to say, this is in the best interest of the town, no matter where I come from which side of the argument I find myself in. I saw compromise, I saw give and take, and I saw an affirmation of what is in the best interest of the town. That to me was remarkable, especially around an issue like the plastic bag issue, which, as like so many other issues, was not only an environmental issue, but also became a political issue, a party political issue. And in spite of that, people were able to work through it and in the end arrive at a warrant or a motion that was passed. And even in that conversation, as it was with the conversation about the facility to produce medical marijuana, which I thought would never pass in Topsfield, people continue to listen and speak to each other in a way that I found remarkable for the time that we live in. It was for me a good experience, and I left, after several conversations that we had after the meeting, I left with feeling good and feeling at home in the town. And this morning when I picked up my copy of the Tri-Town transcript, I saw that the front page says the Finance Committee was grilled. Perhaps I'm used to a rougher atmosphere or environment in the church, but I didn't experience that as severe grilling. It was not that bad, I thought. We find in the book of Acts a description of the ideal Christian community. It is about 2 generations after the events that the author of the book of Acts, which is the same as the author of Luke, Acts is actually part 2 of the Gospel of Luke. When that author looks back, probably in the year 85 to 90 when the book was composed, looking back at it, some authors placed it much later, but let's say around 90, the year 90 when it was written. Looking back at it, and this author describes the ideal Christian community in his book, giving us a picture of how he perceived the Jerusalem church. Because Acts is all about the dominance and the preeminence of the Jerusalem church. It was written to say that church, that is sort of head office of the church, of the Jesus movement, which became the early church. And nothing can really happen in the church, wherever in the world, if the Jerusalem church is not satisfied with it, if the Jerusalem church does not give its stamp of approval of whatever happens. And the author of Acts is in a constant, sometimes below the surface, sometimes very clearly above the surface, a dispute with the Apostle Paul, trying to cut Paul down to size, so to speak. Because Paul was operating not in cooperation with the Jerusalem church, or not sufficiently according to them. He was doing his own thing, and starting churches all over. And I think maybe there was a bit of jealousy mixed in as well. So, this guy is not even from Jerusalem. He's from the city of Tarsus. Look what he's doing, walking around starting churches without consulting head office. It's not on. That's what we find in the book of Acts, and those of you that come to the Bible studies will know that this is what we've been working through for a few months now, finding it back in that book of Acts. It gives a description of the ideal Christian community, and why I say ideal. Some scholars have very long theses on this, why it is not actual events, but a description of the ideal community. For me, it's sufficient reason to say that it's written there. They sold everything and shared equally with everybody that needed anything. I don't think that happens in the real world. Whether you're the early church or whatever movement, if you just say, right, I'll cash up, and whoever needs anything, I'll dish out the money. We don't do it that way. It's not human. But we find this description of what the author of Acts think a Christian community looked like and should look like. And all the wonders and signs that were happening as well. Then we find in the book, the other passage, the letter to the Romans, a beautiful passage saying, do not be conformed to be like the world, but be transformed in your mind, and then a beautiful, beautiful description to what you should be conformed to, how you should be transformed. I want to appeal to you today to be conformed to the measure of our town meeting. As church, I've said ad nauseum, too many times probably, we should not be conformed to the world, we should transform the world. I've said that many times from this pulpit and in private conversations. And I've said many times in our conversations and in our being church, and specifically now when we try to formulate our vision and mission, that we should not replicate what is happening in the big picture in the nation with a toxic public discourse, with divisiveness, etc., but that we should be able, as God's people, to find the common ground, to have those crucial conversations where we meet each other and where we are able, as I observed at the town meeting, to take a higher goal and a purpose, and to say, whatever my agenda is, whatever my perspective is, I will, in obedience, follow that higher purpose. I will, in obedience, do what that higher purpose requires of me. That higher purpose for us as Christians, whether it's the early church or whether it is us as church today, can only be one thing: the way of Jesus. Or the great commandment, to make God the priority in our lives and to demonstrate that through living the love of God, expressing the love of God, which includes, in our conversations, to speak to each other in truth and in love. That is still my hope. And I see green shoots of that happening. Over the past month, we've had 3 speakers, which, in cooperation with Steve Whalen and Jackie Cassidy, I arranged to address this and to try and create the climate for us to help us to gather at least in the same room, no matter what our perspectives are, and to talk about matters. And to also identify what are the potential pitfalls that can stand in the way of such a respectful and a loving conversation. I want to invite you again. Come Wednesday evening. Let us talk. Give your input in what you see as what kind of church we need to be. What kind of church we need to be to have a sustainable future. Not only that, but a future in which we can flourish, in which we can be the light of the world, in which we are able to transform the world and lead this town and other surrounding towns so that we can resemble what Jesus called the kingdom of God, that condition that prevails when the love of God is expressed in concrete terms. Let us do that. And I feel very strange to take a town meeting as the measure for church, but I think we are also very fortunate that we are able to say that as a practical demonstration of what can happen in spite of the national political climate. Let us embrace that, but above all, let us embrace the teaching and the example of Jesus, and together walk in that way. Let us embrace each other as we find each other in that common ground, which the Bible, as our sacred text, indicates to us. In 2 weeks' time, it will be Pentecost. A major date on the calendar of the church. A time that signifies wonder, mystery, new things, new life. May that also be the road that we travel together as God's people, so that the mystery of the Spirit may also bring new life to us and speak to us and feed us as we experienced this morning around the table of love. May the Spirit lead us in that way, to be conformed, to resemble Jesus and his way of being in the world. Amen.